Have you seen Jay Leno recently? Well, you may find yourself thinking, if he'd been better at late night talk shows, he might not be in as much debt with the mafia. And I know us as a society. We tend to always think that we can do better whenever we see something. We can be a better parent. We can be a better guard at the Cincinnati Zoo. Or hell, we can even run a social media company better. But unlike those scenarios, Killer Frequency actually gives us a means to test if we actually would be a more successful talk show host. Coming from Team 17, Killer Frequency finds us in the shoes of Forrest Nash, as we man a small-town, late-night talk radio gig as a campy slasher mystery unfolds in the 80s. Through dialogue and puzzle solving, it's up to the player to try and save everyone that they talk to, as the phone lines have been cut and the cops are gone. So, when the only dispatcher in town redirects 911 calls to the radio station, it opens up for some crazy scenarios. And with anywhere from 4 to 6-ish hours of playtime on your hands at a price of $24.99 US, I've got to say that your enjoyment of this will hinge on your ability to lean into that 80s horror camp that I already mentioned. Now, if that's too cheesy for you, or you don't really appreciate dialogue-heavy games, then this won't be for you either. So I want to make that clear off the bat. If it is something that you'd be interested in, I'd also, be remiss not to point out that the game does go on a pretty deep discount anytime that, there's a summer sale. But anyways, back to the game itself, I wanted to spend just a bit of time with the SCAV, or as I say, the story, gameplay, audio, and visuals. The story is, in my opinion, a bit long and drawn out. There's even a point where it felt like there were too many layers being added to the story, but everything does get wrapped up nicely, so I did kind of, bite my tongue, bite my words, whatever it was. What starts as a return of a murderous local legend in the same vein of Michael Myers very quickly turns into a much deeper mystery of who, what, when, where, and why, and the game has a pretty good pacing of revealing new information about the mystery, while also going from a greatest hits of different horror slasher scenarios that work as the game's puzzles. The cast of characters you meet is quite diverse, and that's all without ever seeing pretty much anyone at all. The game is completely audio-based in that regard. Now, I do think the predictability of the story is worth noting, but some of the ways that it plays out can be quite entertaining just to see it in action. Like leading a team through a corn maze based off of a map that you have, as you can hear the chainsaw getting closer or getting further away in the background of the call was just an awesome sequence. Or for a more serious one, talking a woman through stabilizing her boyfriend after he had been stabbed, giving her proper medical advice so he didn't go into shock. My personal favorite through line was the owner of the pizza shop repeatedly trying to call in and advertise his pizza, which that wasn't really one that you had to save ever, but it was just a nice little thing to kind of break up the monotony of always trying to save lives. This was still a radio show after all. One thing I will say about the writing of the game overall, it can be very funny. But one thing I will say is that the characters, because this is an entirely audio-based game, and they have to describe these scenarios to you, it feels like they're breaking their own archetypes. You've got the town redneck who's perfectly describing what's going on around him. To paint a very clear picture, to be sure, there's a reason for the gameplay, that it's exactly what you need to hear. However, I just didn't find it very convincing that these characters in these moments of, dire need would be able to properly articulate themselves just like that. Maybe that's me nitpicking, but that was the biggest thing that stood out to me, was that maybe the writing could be a bit more varied with how the characters describe their situations. Now, on the inverse of this, Forrest in his offhanded comments or the dialogue that you choose both perfectly conveys how nerve-wracking these scenarios are, and even earlier on when he makes some quick little snide comments about how, radio and being live can be a little anxiety-filled, but for him, it seems like it's more of a return from a fall from grace rather than the actual nerves of this killer scenario. Now, I've already kind of basically broken down the gameplay and given you a few scenarios already. I don't want to spoil the game as it's still only 4 to 6 hours long. However, I will talk in general about how I liked the puzzles, and a lot of them were pretty simple, but they felt good enough to solve. Situations where you have to tell people where to go or what to do, and the world building were all very rewarding and satisfying. The one thing I wasn't really a big fan of is what I'll call the detective session of Killer Frequency, where you actually do get a chance to step away from being on air and you can kind of explore the radio station just a little bit, but it turns into quite a lot of it as well. What I mean is, throughout the course of the game, you're going to be unlocking more of the radio station, to find more clues about whatever situation you're in. For instance, finding that map to the corn maze earlier down in the trash can downstairs. But the thing I didn't really like about this section as much was that it just felt very, I don't want to say unnecessary, but none of the puzzles really demanded much. I mean, hell, a lot of the times I found the items for puzzles that I needed before I actually needed them, and that wasn't frustrating except for the fact that I actually had to go and interact with these items again to open up the dialogue option when the time came. I couldn't do it beforehand and just know that information. But again, that is what it is. You could call it me trying to sequence break. Regardless though, I thought the monotony of these sections looking around for items wasn't really justified within the gameplay for me. I think the entertainment value of this game comes entirely from the radio session. So perhaps they could have downsized it to, for the majority of it, there is 1 or 2 sections in the story where you do need to leave the office. But I think the majority of it could have been downsized to just being in maybe the radio room and the adjoining room right next to it, and just been a little more dense overall. But as we move on to the audio section of the game, what can I say? The voice acting is superb. I will say it leans a little heavily on the camp with certain characters and kind of archetypes of characters. But again, that's, I think, if anything, trying to over-enunciate the situation that they're in. But otherwise, Forrest sounds great. Peggy, great. All of these characters are superb. The sound effects, as they come through the radio and the phone calls specifically, that little, kind of staticiness to it and the unclarity of these situations is great. Hell, even the sound effects and music as you go around this station itself are wonderful. As for the game's actual soundtrack, I do feel like it's a little bit bare. Maybe that's just me, but like the actual tracks that play whenever someone's in grave danger and you're down to the wire trying to tell them what to do properly, it did feel like it was getting a bit repetitive with that same kind of boom, 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 boom track. But that by no means is meant to take away from the actual quality of the music within the game. To kind of round things out with the actual visuals of the game, there's not really any character models or in detail look at any characters. Peggy is covered in shadows in the other room, and the only other character model you really see in the game is the killer in the opening of the game. But they have a mask on. So in that way, I feel like there was no, budget or animation issues where that took away from my immersion in the game. And the game world itself felt pretty good. I didn't really have any bugs or anything like that. There's physics simulation to the sense of where it's kind of like amnesia. You can pick things up, throw them. You never have to solve any puzzles that way, of course. But, the dragging to open doors and stuff like that is a really cool effect overall. I can't really say I have any complaints when it comes to the visuals as a whole. I think if I were to use this section to talk about the world building, I think the spaces that were created for the lobby area, the bathrooms, the other desks and places like that, all felt very believable and added a lot to the experience. While I didn't enjoy the fact of having to go around to look for puzzle answers, I did at least enjoy walking through these areas and being meticulous and looking at things at least once. I will give the game that. But to kind of round out, I would say Killer Frequency is a game that I really enjoyed. I played it in 2 sittings. The puzzles in the game felt both easy enough to understand and comprehend, nothing too hard, yet the fact that any error whatsoever could result in a character's death, it really did raise the stakes overall. That combined with the, charming nature of the campy 80s thriller movie really does go a long way for the atmosphere. Now, the actual gameplay itself of that can get a little boring at times, but overall it's that voice acting and just wonderful feeling of being a radio host that goes such a long way in leading you through this experience. And then once you're hooked into the story and you're locked in, well, you're there, man. So I would say for the price of the game and what it is, I would say there's some mild replayability, especially if you don't save everyone on your first go. I would say the game is worth it to me personally. However, as I've already mentioned, the game is on deep sale. So if you weren't looking for the game for $25, being down to less than $10 is an absolute steal for this game. and I could recommend this to anyone who is even on the fence about it at that price. But anyways, that's it for me. Thank you so much for watching this video. Check out some other videos that I've done recently, with my most recent review being Angerfoot, and the other bigger video that I did lately was a huge retrospective over 2 hours long for Alien Isolation. With the next video, I'm starting to workshop ideas for what it's going to be, but it should be pretty exciting, so stay tuned for another long form video like that. And yeah, consider subscribing, maybe like the video, it'd help me out a bunch. Thank you for watching, goodbye.